If you think that you don't buy $1,000 bottles and therefore wine fraud doesn't affect you, you're wrong. There's been a lot of Miraval Rosé that's counterfeit. There's more and more Brunello de Montalcino in the $40 range that is coming out as counterfeit. So this really does hit all aspects of the industry. And that is because we have seen such low punishment for those who get caught doing this that organized crime has gotten into the game. Because if you get caught human trafficking or trafficking drugs, you're going away forever. You get caught counterfeiting wine or selling counterfeit wine, you maybe get a slap on the wrist, if that.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 29. In today's episode, we're chatting with Maureen Downey, a.k.a. the Wine Detective, about wine forgeries, fakes, and scandals. You're going to learn tips on how to spot a fake wine based on the label and a whole lot more. A companion episode to this interview is the very first podcast I did for this show, and it was with New York author Pete Hellman, who wrote about one particular wine fraudster, Rudy Kurniawan, in Pete's best-selling book, In Vino Duplicatas, The Rise and Fall of a Wine Forger. If you missed that one, go back and have a listen, because he tells one of the most gripping stories about human greed. This interview yielded such terrific insights and fascinating stories that I didn't want to delete the parts where Maureen's audio isn't great, as her connection was choppy, especially at the beginning. I think you'll agree with me if you stick with it. Enjoy. We've talked about this a little bit in the past, about wine fakes and wine forgery, but I am fascinated with this. What propels someone to try to fake a bottle of wine worth $1,000? And what propels someone to buy it? Why weren't they doing their homework? I mean, just that whole thing about human nature, forgeries and fakes. Our guest this evening is known as the Sherlock Holmes of wines. She is an expert on rare wines and an authority on wine fraud, counterfeit, and fine wine authentication. She earned a degree in hospitality from Boston University, and she took the advanced sommelier exam at the age of 23. Over the past 20 years, she has inspected hundreds of millions of dollars worth of both authentic and counterfeit wine. She advises some of the world's top collectors in purchasing, selling, and managing their collections with her firm, Shea Consulting, based in San Francisco. She has assisted the government prosecution in the biggest wine counterfeiting case ever tried by the U.S. government and continues to work with law enforcement to investigate wine fraud cases. You can also catch her in the new Netflix film, Sour Grapes. And she joins me now from her home in San Francisco. Welcome, Maureen Downey.
Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, pleasure. We are fascinated by this topic, Maureen. To get us started, maybe you can tell us why you became interested in the whole wine fraud. You've got a great wine background and training, but what intrigued you about wine fraud?
I started learning about counterfeit wine really when I was working at a wine auction house in New York and started to encounter counterfeit wine. And as soon as I started finding that, I thought it was just crazy. And I started to learn more and more about it. Had a little run in with Hardy Rosenstock where he taught me a thing or two in the process of making sure he wasn't buying his own counterfeit. I just started to really notice it. A little bit of OCD goes a long way when you're trying to look at anomalies, so that helped. And then I became really fascinated with the fact that nobody else seemed to care. So all of those things kind of came together and have propelled me. through my career for the last 20 years.
Huh, wow. Now, Hardy Rosenstock, is that the character, the central figure in Benjamin Wallace's Billionaire's Vinegar?
He is Hardy Rodenstock. His real name is Meinhard Gorka. He's a German music promoter turned wine aficionado turned creator and peddler of some of the most famous counterfeits that we know because so many of them got 100 points, which really kind of created the market moving forward. He's kind of the godfather of modern counterfeiting.
Quite a distinction, being ground zero for counterfeiting. Now, when you say 100 points, are you referring to probably Robert Parker scores or Wine Spectator?
I am. So what happened in the 80s when Robert Parker was coming up, he had several different vendors that he worked with, people that he knew, people that seemed to be legitimate. One of those were the guys at Royal Wine Merchants. And they introduced Robert Parker to this Hardy Rodenstock man who seemed to have all of these amazing wines, very famous 100 pointers like 1961 Petrus and things like that. There is some question because nobody has experience tasting these wines over and over again, except for maybe Serena Sutcliffe and David Peppercorn. But over time, wine changes so much. And they were given 100 points, and he wrote descriptions. And those descriptions have been used by other counterfeiters to create counterfeits as well. And we know that Hardy Rodenstock made quite a number of counterfeits himself.
Wow, that is quite the story. Maureen, when it comes to counterfeit wines, you just alluded to this, but what are the different facets you're looking for to determine what is a fake? There must be so many, from the label to the cork to this capsule, but can you kind of run through the big things that you're looking for when it comes to a fake?
When we're talking about looking at the bottle for authenticity, obviously we can't open the bottle, nor can we draw out any wine. And even though I know that there are a lot of different companies that claim that they can pull out liquid or they can look through the bottle and see if it's real, you have to have an example of every kind of wine imaginable. So everything that we have to look at is forensic. So is the glass correct? Anybody who's got a bottle in front of them, you can look at the markings, you can look at shape and how the seams are, and every type of glass is slightly different. If you ever have the good opportunity to meet with Olivier Krug, you'll see him at a tasting kind of fondling the top of bottles and kind of go, what is he doing that for? He is specifically doing that to make sure that those Krug bottles have the correct thickness of the lip because he has found counterfeit bottles just based on that tiny difference in glass. We look at things like labels. Is the label the correct size? Does it look like the rest of the bottle? Sometimes you'll have a bottle that has a really beat up capsule and a high fill level and a pristine looking label. And those things kind of don't go. Or it's got a beat up label, a perfect capsule, and a very low fill. Well, that doesn't make sense either. Because if there was seepage, if there was some sort of condition, those conditions should be consistent throughout. I love ink and glue. We can actually look at different chemical compounds and properties in paper and glue and age those things and say, okay, well, because this glows under UV light, it must have been produced after this year when the chemical that reacts to the UV light was first patented and used. And then, of course, we use a lot of magnification, and the magnification will show us what type of print method there is, what the true colors of the ink are, what the true nature of the ink is, how the ink was applied to the label. And all of those things together tell us a picture. And that picture tells us a story. Unfortunately, DRC was not authentically making wine in Southern California in 1914 on a home laser jet printed computer and printer. So we can put all these little pieces together and figure it out.
It's like CSI for wine, and I imagine that's why you're also called the wine detective in addition to Sherlock Holmes, but I've heard some really amazing things. Are people using sort of banknote technology and infrared to determine, like, the quality of the label and the paper now?
We do that. We
That
definitely do that. Yeah, some producers are using paper that has certain codes in it, such that the code of that paper will tell us exactly who milled that paper. And there's a lot of invisible ink being used. There's a lot of holograms being used. There's hologram infused actually into the paper in a lot of these cases. There are also a lot of holograms on capsules.
Really? How do they get a hologram into a capsule?
on a capsule. The same way that you would print any other design onto a capsule, anything that can be printed. And that's why we see such a move to digital printing in the fine wine industry. All the printing is going to digital print so that people can include this invisible ink and hologram printing. It's no more expensive, but
Wow.
unfortunately, all of these are what I call cosmetic solutions because all they do is they protect the packaging. And they protect the packaging such that unfortunately a lot of these bottles could be refilled, and then all of that anti-fraud would serve to authenticate a counterfeit refill.
Wow. Okay, so counterfeiters are getting more and more sophisticated. So what goes beyond the cosmetic fraud prevention? What steps do you take beyond that?
Well, right now there aren't a lot of, I think, workable solutions. There's a lot of ideas out there where people want to look at the liquid, they want to analyze different things. Cesium 137 testing was first used by Paul Pontillier in 2003 when he found a bunch of counterfeits that were allegedly B&G bottled 1900 Margot, and he had those tested at the University of Bordeaux. It was the first time that they used this kind of testing. Unfortunately, you need a liquid sample, and all that it tells you is whether something is pre or post nuclear. When you're talking about the fact that across the street is the difference between a $10,000 bottle and a $200 or even a $100 or a $50 bottle, we need something a lot more precise than that.
Yeah, to dig into that because you've gone into an advanced concept, which is fascinating. So it's radioactive dating, and we know that most wines post 1952 did not have the element that you indicated, the cesium, silesium, or whatever it
Cesium
was.
137.
There you go. Because after 1952, they were doing lots of nuclear tests between the US, Russia, and so on. So physicists can measure the radioactivity in a wine and sort of date it to the exact vintage.
Not to
So
the exact vintage.
no?
You can
Okay.
only get it within like a 50-year span, and that doesn't help.
Oh,
I mean, that's great if you're dating Mayan art, but if you're dating something where from vintage to vintage, it can
yeah.
be a huge difference.
I'll bet.
Between 1944 and 1945 in Bordeaux is pretty significant.
Exactly. So the only thing you would know is that if someone were to claim that this is a 1942 whatever, and it had that radioactivity, they would know that's a fake, but that's a very gross measure, like it's not very
Right, it doesn't
precise.
tell you anything else. It doesn't tell you what it actually is. And the problem is that that testing is so difficult and so expensive. It's not something that somebody can do at home. It's not something that auction houses do or resellers do. I mean, we can't get most resellers in the world to even inspect bottles, much less test them. And
Why is
that's one of
that?
the other problems that I have with cosmetic solutions, including something like a proof tag. A proof tag is a little sticker that goes on between the capsule and the glass. And nobody actually scans them unless they've got the bottle at the table. And if you've got the bottle at the table, it's too late. People need information such that they can make intelligent, fact based purchases. And
Yeah,
that's why my team and I have decided to employ blockchain technology to make the authenticity and the provenance of the bottle visible to potential buyers online, no matter where they are in the world, before they purchase a bottle.
purchase.
That's when people need the information.
So is wine tainted by
Yeah,
radioactives?
they did a lot of testing after Fukushima because obviously, especially over here, and I'm in San Francisco, and there's a lot of concern about our fish and some of our food products. And wine is a food product. Wine is a consumable product, which is why counterfeit wine, I think, should be taken more seriously. A lot of people don't take it very seriously, but we have to remember it's consumable. So they did a lot of testing, and even with the effects of Fukushima, the radioactive levels of the grapes themselves, grape juice, and then finally of the wine product was way under anything that we need to worry about.
Okay. Fukushima, explain what that was?
Fukushima, the meltdown of the nuclear plant in Japan a
Okay.
couple of years ago, we're still seeing a lot of effects of that. I'm an ocean and animal freak, and anybody that cares about oceans should be a little bit concerned because that nuclear accident really affected the Pacific Ocean quite a bit. But we're
And
okay. Our wine is okay. Hooray.
yay, thank God for that. How about Chernobyl? Did that affect wine much?
I'm sure that it had this similar effect, especially in the immediate area. But no, there's been no long-term effect.
Okay. So you were talking about blockchain. Take us into this gently for those of us who are not familiar with blockchain or big techies, what it is, how it is used to detect wine fraud, and what you've developed, Maureen.
So first, let me go back and state the issue. And for 20 years, I've been working in the fine wine category, and I worked in auctions for many years, and I've been managing private wine collections. And it's not just the crusty old 1960 bottle that we need to worry about, because the current wine fraud that we're seeing is recent vintages, recent releases. So if you think that you don't buy $1,000 bottles and therefore wine fraud doesn't affect you, you're wrong. There's been a lot of Miraval Rosé that's counterfeit. There's more and more Brunello de Montalcino in the $40 range that is coming out as counterfeit. So this really does hit all aspects of the industry. And that is because we have seen such low punishment for those who get caught doing this that organized crime has gotten into the game. Because if you get caught human trafficking or trafficking drugs, you're going away forever. You get caught counterfeiting wine or selling counterfeit wine, you maybe get a slap on the wrist, if that, literally. The problem that I continue to see is, as somebody that worked at an auction house, if I sold you a bottle, Natalie, and 10 years later you decided that you wanted to sell that wine because you wanted to buy a new house or you were putting your niece through college, there are a number of reasons why people sell wine. There's a lot of very good and altruistic reasons. If that were to happen, even though I sold it to you, when you present it to somebody else for sale, it has to be presented as though it's a brand new entity and nobody's ever seen it before. So the amount of time and resources that go into inspecting that bottle and taking it from scratch again are high. So that was one problem. I wanted a way we could follow the provenance of a bottle through the ownership channel and the distribution channel, going back to the producer, in a way that was meaningful and in a way that could be communicated to a potential buyer. So I looked at this for many, many years, and unfortunately, so many solutions have been based on technologies that immediately become antiquated that nothing seemed to fit. The blockchain is a distributed ledger, meaning it doesn't live on my computer and it doesn't live only on your computer. It only lives on both of our computers at the same time. So it's out there. We don't own it. It's like the internet. Once you create a piece of information on the blockchain, you cannot corrupt that piece of information. Every time somebody writes a note in their ledger, that note shows up magically in everybody else's ledger. So, like a Harry Potter book. This is basically what it does. If we can get these bottles inputted at the time of production, and we do that by putting an RFID chip between the cork and the capsule, which also serves as anti-fraud in case anybody pierces it with a needle, then we can track this bottle through the distribution chain. And when I go to purchase it at auction after you're selling it, I can go online and I can see either on the auctioneer's website or on winesearch.com a hyperlink that'll take me directly to the ledger of authenticity and provenance in the blockchain.
What is an RFID chip?
An RFID chip is a very dumb computer chip that does not need an antenna, it doesn't need power, and it's passive. So it waits for somebody to scan it. Now, the good thing about using RFID is that it's very affordable and it will allow for great inventory management. It will also live forever because it's dumb. So it's kind of the keep it simple, stupid. I've got to keep this simple because it needs to be viable in 70 years. I recognize that any high technology that is around today is fodder for school children in a couple of years. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I am not confused about the fact that technology is fleeting and we need to use a robust solution. So we're using kind of a low tech layered with high tech technologies.
Okay. And now you mentioned something about a needle going into the capsule as the exception. Like Coravin is a way of preserving your wine and just extracting the amount you want to drink by puncturing the capsule and cork with a needle, extracting the wine, and then the cork reseals. How do you prevent that kind of fraud?
We do need to prevent that because that is real fraud. People have reverse engineered the same idea as the Coravin to be able to empty wine bottles that are worth many thousands of dollars, then refill them, and they will have perfect packaging. If they've got perfect packaging, they would be authenticated as being perfect. So we have to have a solution whereby We're actually adding a secondary anti-fraud on top. We're using a diamond dust solution that is scannable. When you put diamond dust into food grade plastic, it will settle in such a way that no two results are ever the same. We're actually layering on top of the RFID this diamond dust solution. And if it's been pierced, it won't scan the same.
Wow, that is really complex. Diamond dust and then the RFID. Maureen, do you have any famous examples of really stupid fake bottles, like where they've really mashed up the name of the wine or some descriptor on the bottle?
There are a number of them. And actually, there are 20 main points that we look at in authentication. And one of them is information. And there's a lot of different aspects of that information, whether the labels match labeling laws that we know to be in place at the time. In Rudy's case, he did something like the street was Sackville Street instead of Sackville Street. He also made some errors on old French labels. Sometimes you would see imprimé en France, which means printed in France, but he spelled imprimé wrong. He spelled it INPRINE. Or Philibert Ennui. It was supposed to be an A with an accent, and instead he had an O with a cedilla. There are a number of different things. I've even seen misspelled corks because people counterfeit corks as well. So we've seen a lot of that. And when it comes to information, some of the things that we look at is, for example, the government formation of any particular company is typically on the front of a French wine label. So DRC will say Société de la Romanée Conti, but there are different types of company formations. And sometimes counterfeiters will take a label from a certain year and they'll make another year and they will get it wrong because for the time period that they're making the counterfeit is incorrect. They're using a more modern label. So we look at things like that all the time.
Absolutely. I've seen lots of fake ice wine labels from Canada that are made somewhere abroad, but they'll be from Whistler, BC, ice, snow. That's where we
Yeah.
go skiing, so they must have ice wine. There's not the conditions to grow ice wine. But you have a term called unicorn wines. What are they in the world of fake wines?
So unicorn wine, this is a term that we've been using for a long time, and some of the New York City sommeliers have taken it to mean very rare wine. But I don't know what they're doing drug wise, but unicorns don't exist, people. I'm sorry if I'm the bearer of bad news here. Unicorns are mythical, and therefore the unicorn wines that we talk about are mythical wines. They are wines that exist only in the mind of the counterfeiter that was dumb enough to make the bottle and in the victim who was unfortunate enough to purchase the bottle. And these include different things like combinations of vineyard and vintage that don't exist, like Laurent Ponceau, Domaine Ponceau making Claude LaRoche before 1982, things like that. But it's also things like a 3 liter of 1945 Romanée Conti. DRC never made that. DRC never bottled that. Nobody took bottles back to DRC to create a 3 liter or even a Magnum. There is, however, a guy in France who's pumping out a couple Magnums a year and continues to sell them.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so as regular buyers of wine, Maureen, what are the tips we can use? We're not in the rarefied world of Sotheby's auctions and so on, but we're out there. As you said, wine fraud isn't just
Mhm.
about really expensive wines. What should we be looking for on a bottle? What are the key tips that you can share with us to prevent us from buying a fake?
So I think it goes actually back to more the source of the wine that you're looking at. I've been working with the FBI very closely since 2008. For many years, we had a dedicated agent who just did nothing but wine fraud. And despite the fact that we got a lot of really good convictions, John Fox of Premier Cruise, one that you guys might have heard of, Rudy Corneo one, obviously, but there's a number of other convictions that we got for smaller criminals. Unfortunately, they have dropped the dedicated wine person because they just don't see that producers care enough and that victims care enough to fight this. The TTB and the ABC in the state of California do not care if people have licenses to sell wine online or not. They don't care. It's a misdemeanor. They're not going after anybody who doesn't have a license. So do not think that because you are buying from a government agency, you are safe. You're not. The number one thing to do is make sure that you're buying only from trustworthy, vetted vendors. Trustworthy means people who have not been embroiled in huge wine fraud scandals. If people have been in the news for wine fraud, there's a reason. Don't give them your business. There's plenty of good people to give your business to. If the deal seems too good to be true, it is. One of the other things that we need to mention of talking about wine fraud, counterfeit wine isn't the only problem. Damaged wine is a huge problem. And damaged wine is a huge problem in the United States. And it's spreading everywhere because we've had a couple of years of horrible fires and horrible hurricanes. That is tens of millions of dollars of destroyed wine that is going to end up back in the marketplace. So if it's too good to be true, it is. Make sure that you're dealing only with reputable vendors. And if you're buying secondary market wines,
And what do you
um,
mean by that, secondary market?
secondary market means if you're not the first owner, if somebody else has owned the bottle already. It's not old wine only, it's rare wine. It's very hard to find a bottle of CRT or some of the first gross. The demand globally is so big that these wines are allocated and then people flip their allocations. Well, that's also where all the counterfeits come in. So make sure that you're asking questions about where the wine is from. If the vendor is annoyed that you're asking questions, find another one. On winefraud.com, on the public side, we have a list of vendors all over the world that we suggest. And we are training a whole bunch of people around the world to be authenticators. And they're constantly feeding us information. If you have questions about whether a vendor is reputable or not, you could always contact us at info@winefraud.com and we are happy to help.
What else should we think about, Maureen? Buy from a reputable dealer. If it's too good to be true, it is. Are there things we should be looking for on the label other than obvious misspellings? Is there anything else, quick tips that we can, as consumers, look for when we're trying to spot a fake?
I think the big thing is just consistency. Consistency is something that I train authenticators to really focus on. And it's kind of like, if you see a beautiful woman walking down the street and, she's got like really tight, beautiful 25-year-old skin, but you can clearly tell that she's maybe 65 in the body, there's been some work done, and or vice versa. You have a bottle of wine that's got a horrible capsule and a perfect fill and a perfect label, take a second look. Or if you have a bottle that is allegedly really old, but it's got a perfect label and a perfect capsule and a really low fill, those things are just not consistent. The different pieces of the bottle, just like different pieces of our body, should go together. So if it looks like it's kind of been a Frankenstein put together, then it might just be. And trust your gut. There's always another bottle. Be willing to walk away and trust your gut, and you'll be fine.
That's good advice. And for you this year, what is your biggest challenge? What are you most looking forward to doing within this world of wine fraud? I know you're going to be launching your beta version, but what else is out there? What do you want to do next?
Take a vacation. No, I'm really looking forward to getting the Shea Vault launched. That's something that we've been talking about for years. I was working with a vendor that just couldn't get it done. They couldn't get his prototype. A couple months ago, I fell off a roof and I had a lot of time sitting on a couch. So I was able to get it done and get a new vendor and get it all going. And so this year, we're going to be rolling out the Shea Vault for both producers and in the secondary market. I've got all these authenticators. We're doing our wine fraud presentation and authentication trainings in New York for the first time ever. Lots of people wanted us in New York. What I say, I'm going to the snake's den. I'm going to have extra security. There are a lot of people in New York that are very angry that I'm fighting this fight. I've had to take bodyguards to La Palais for the last several years after being assaulted.
Because many folks have a vested interest in not revealing fraud. So let's just talk about that for one moment. The people who have bought these fakes, they don't want to be revealed as stupid, rich, whatever, not discerning,
There
right?
is one auction house in New York that created Rudy Kurniawan, that funded Rudy Kurniawan, that got their clients to then fund Rudy Kurniawan, who sold tens and tens of millions of counterfeit bottles. They were a non-entity before Rudy Kurniawan and Eric Greenberg, who also sold a lot of counterfeit wine. Greenberg was successfully sued by Bill Koch. It came out in that trial that Eric Greenberg was in business with Rudy Kurniawan to, quote, sell suspects Bordeaux. And this auction house was nothing before those two. And now they claim to be the largest auction house in the world for wine. So I am not popular. I'm not okay with some of the tasting notes that are written and that just open misogyny and disgusting behavior. And I've been very vocal about that for quite a long time, and that is not appreciated.
No, and being a woman who's whistleblowing, that must be tough.
Yeah, it's not easy. Fortunately, I have a lot of good friends and supporters like Pete Hellman. who've been really important in this fight. We wouldn't know nearly what we know about Rudy without Pete.
Wow, that's quite a tribute. And I would think that, well, the auction houses, as you've suggested, and a lot of the retailers would have a vested interest in, and even some of the wineries, I would say, don't want to think that their wines are out there and are fake. It would damage the brand. So, I mean, when buyers come forward and say, this is a fake, I think I've read somewhere where you said they're asked to sign non disclosure agreements.
Almost all of the counterfeit wine that we find in private collections, the vendors will only give a refund to the buyers if they sign a non disclosure agreement and return the bottles. If you have a bottle of Enriched, a.k.a. Richebourg 1978 that you purchased 10 years ago, of course Acker Merrill Condit wants that bottle back because they're going to pay you your $3,000 and then they're going to turn around and sell it for $30,000. It's become a cottage industry.
Oh,
Vendors are all too happy to take back counterfeits. Only after you sign an NDA, though. I will not be a party to any of those NDAs because the whole thing just makes me ill. These wines are not getting taken out of circulation. At the end of Sour Grapes, you saw a couple hundred bottles get smashed. Those bottles were part of Rudy Cornillone's private 5,000 bottle cellar. They were mostly blending wines in that collection. None of those wines are wines that had ever been sold on the market. All of the wines that were sold and or sold in return still out there. They're still there. And most of the time when we find counterfeits, the vendors require that our clients send them back. So that is really frustrating. And this is not an auction problem. Anybody that thinks that this is an auction problem is living in a bygone era. This is a huge problem for retailers and brokers. Auction houses, for the most part, are actually doing something to combat this. They actually inspect the bottles. Most brokers don't even ever see the bottles. And most retailers would prefer to hide behind willful ignorance. You would think that these seminars that we're doing would be exploding. You would think that every retailer out there would want at least to talk to me about wine fraud. But a lot of them, they don't want to know about it. They don't want to hear about it. If they are blissfully ignorant, they can just, oh, I didn't know. My attitude is if you're selling expensive and rare wine, it is your job to know. And if you're selling a consumable product, it is your job to make sure that you are a consumer advocate no matter what. In my opinion, there's nobody that sells wines and spirits who is above making sure that what they're selling is authentic and not refilled and not tainted.
yeah. Hear no evil, see no evil. That doesn't cut it.
Exactly.
And you were saying in a piece I read, Rudy's alone, his wines that are still out there, his fake wines on the market could be worth $550 million.
At least.
Just one man, one counterfeiter. I mean, imagine how much counterfeit wine is out there.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. Wow. Maureen, this has just zipped by. This has been a fabulous conversation. Is there something that we haven't mentioned that you'd like to mention now?
I don't think so. I want for people to know that we really are consumer advocates and we want people to send us questions and let us know if you've had issues, if there's a firm that you have a problem with. I still do work with the FBI on a regular basis. We just don't have a dedicated wine fraud person anymore. If you're interested in this topic, winefraud.com is a great resource. And if you're interested in learning more, we are looking for more authenticators. All the information is on winefraud.com. And as I said, we are definitely looking for more authenticators because Shea Vault is going to need to be implemented in the secondary market to vendors and who want to do that. And we need people to do that.
Okay, well, folks, you know where to contact Maureen then at winefraud.com. I'm sure lots of folks will be interested in that. Maureen, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Fascinating chat. I could have chatted with you another 2 hours or more.
Thank you. If people follow me on Twitter at Movino, Moevino, I will post some pictures.
Okay, great. So you'll post some of those fraudulent wine bottles. We'll definitely have that in the show notes as well, Maureen.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Okay,
Bye bye.
thank you, Maureen. Bye bye for now. What a terrific discussion. Here are my takeaways. Number one, I'm fascinated how the wine industry is using CSI techniques to identify fraud, such as the analysis of ink and paper with infrared, banknote, and radioactive dating technology. Even the lip of the glass bottle is a tell. 2. There are some really exciting new developments on the horizon that will help reduce wine fraud, such as hologram-infused capsules, invisible ink, and blockchain technology. 3. Fraud isn't just rampant among expensive wines. It's also now prevalent among affordable wines that we drink every day because the consequences are so low compared to the potential payoffs. That's going to get even more likely with wine that's damaged by wildfires coming onto the market when it shouldn't. This is something we've discussed in my private Facebook group for my online course students. It's quite a debate. Number 4, it'll be interesting to see if the wine industry can counteract fraud from gadgets that are similar in terms of how they operate, like the Coravan system that can empty a pricey bottle of wine without ever removing the cork. These gadgets can then refill it in the same way, the needle through the cork, with inexpensive wine. The trifecta of the label, the capsule, and the fill level is going to pass all of the current tests. It'll be interesting to see if diamond dust that settles in a certain way or RFID chips will help this situation, but who really knows? Number 5, as Maureen says, if it's too good to be true, it usually is. There are no unicorn wines. They're as mythical as unicorns themselves. We only keep them alive because we want to believe that they're true. You'll find the links to Maureen's company and to her social media handles in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/29. Did you know that you can now listen to this podcast on your smart speaker? Just say, "Hey Google," or for Amazon's Echo, use her name that begins with the letter A. I won't say it now as it'll set off your device and mine, so I'll use Madam A, as in, Madam A, play the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'd love to chat with you about wine when you're doing the dishes, the laundry, having breakfast, lunch, dinner. Yes, it's always wine time. So what was your favorite tip or quote from this episode? Share that with me on Twitter or Facebook and tag me at Natalie MacLean. Or on Instagram, I'm at Natalie MacLean Wine. If you like this episode, please tell one friend about it, especially someone who's interested in wine and true crime. My podcast is easy to find, whether you search on Google on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or on my name. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair wine and food to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemaclean.com/class. On next week's show, I'll be chatting about Canada Day wines just in time for your July 1st celebrations. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.